So hey, as you can see, we are continuing our series this morning in the book of Matthew. And Jesus is yet again on the move, which is kind of the usual thing we've been seeing the last couple weeks. And throughout Matthew, we've seen Jesus in between times of teaching. You see Jesus encounter all kinds of different people. And honestly, like when he encounters literally anyone, he immediately answers their requests and he immediately heals. That's been the vast majority of the rhythm of what Jesus does in his ministry is there's immediacy behind the things that he does. But this morning, things are a little bit different in the conversation we see. He makes this woman wait a little bit. He almost kind of tests her a little bit. And in this, what I would call interesting encounter between Jesus and a woman who's described as a Canaanite, we're going to see the big idea of this morning's passage is that Christ's mercy is given to those who are desperate for it. So this woman encounters Jesus, but she doesn't stop at her first encounter. We're going to see a woman that in search of his mercy, she's not going to suspend her search until she actually finds it. And she's desperate, and Christ's mercy is given to those who approach Christ with a level of desperation. So hopefully you have your Bibles open to Matthew chapter 15. We're going to go ahead and pick right up at verse 21. Matthew tells us when Jesus left there, he withdrew to the area of Tyre and Sidon. So just a little bit of context of where we're at in Matthew 15. So Jesus is leaving. He's withdrawing from there. The there is the region of Galilee. And remember, Jesus has been all over the place in the last few sermons, all in search of rest, right? So he first crosses to the southern shore of the Sea of Galilee, where he wants to find rest, but instead he encounters like 12,000 people who need dinner. Then he crosses to the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee, where again he wants rest, but he encounters a bunch of people who want to be healed. And then he's confronted by religious leaders, which was the sermon last week. The Pharisees and the scribes who had traveled 80 miles north from Jerusalem just to confront Jesus at the fact that his disciples don't wash their hands before they eat. So there's a lot going on, and it didn't end well last week for the religious leaders. Jesus calls them hypocrites, blind guides, and plants that were never planted by the Father to begin with, and plants that would eventually be uprooted. So here's the key to each gospel, but we're in the book of Matthew. The book of Matthew is very much structured by Jesus' travels. As I've said almost every week, up until this point, the bulk of Jesus' teaching and ministry that we've seen in Matthew has been in and around the region of Galilee, which is nowhere near Jerusalem. The further you got outside of Jerusalem in that time, the more Gentiles there were. And so Jesus' teaching or his healing so far since like the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 has kind of been a 50-50 split between Jews and Gentiles. A Gentile is just a non-Jew. Jesus knows one day he's going to turn his face toward Jerusalem. He's going to start walking south and he'll go to Jerusalem, which will be in chapter 16. But when he does this, he knows as he journeys closer to Jerusalem, he's journeying to what would be an imminent death. So Jerusalem is the religious center. The further north you got, it wasn't so much. There's been increasing conflict we've seen between Jesus and the religious leaders in the past couple chapters. Jesus knows all eyes are on what he's doing, and so that kind of helps us a little bit with the context this morning. Jesus now leaves Galilee. He heads north further from Jerusalem. That word withdrew means that Jesus is trying to get away, meaning that Jesus is trying to take like a little bit of a vacation. We see that he has his disciples with him. Maybe they were going on like their annual disciple retreat. We don't know what they were doing, but Matthew tells us they go to the area of Tyre and Sidon. Those are two cities. They're not in those cities, but they're in that region of those two cities. And those are two cities that weren't Jewish friendly. Areas that had been prophesied against in the Old Testament. Areas that didn't always help the Israelites, who were the people of God. If you remember from Matthew 11, if you've been around that long, Jesus basically refers to the city of Tyre as a heathen city. So in and around that region is where Jesus and his disciples are walking. And how funny are we to think that Jesus might actually find rest? No, of course he doesn't. right away the narrative for this morning starts. Matthew tells us, just then a Canaanite woman from that region came and kept crying out, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely tormented by a demon." So if you've been with us during this series, you know that this isn't the first time that people come to Jesus and they're crying out to Jesus, "Lord, would you please heal me?" But look at what Matthew's trying to tell us. This woman is a Canaanite. So not only are Tyre and Sidon two cities that aren't super Jewish friendly, the Canaanites in the Old Testament were quite literally like the absolute enemies of God's people. The Canaanite religion and the Hebrew religion couldn't be more polar opposite. So that's this woman's background, and now she lives in this northern region, and so she doesn't really fit the Jewish model. She's kind of like 0 for 2 if you're going to be friends with a Jewish man. She'd be 0 for 3 considering she's a woman, okay? But here she is. She knows Jesus is in and around where she lives. So she comes out of her house. It's not Jesus at her house. This is her encountering Jesus. And Matthew tells us that in her encounter, she keeps crying out, meaning she did not stop crying out. It's continuous action. A lot of commentators think that she was loud and obnoxious, like crying out in such a way that everyone could hear her. Probably pretty annoying to have around. And she's crying out, "Lord, have mercy on me, Son of David. My daughter is severely tormented by a demon." So just what her request is interesting in itself. It would be one thing if she just said, "Have mercy on me, Lord," because Lord would be an address to somebody in authority, but instead she throws out Son of David, a Jewish title for whoever the Messiah might be. But remember, she's not Jewish. She's far from Jewish. Yet she's citing David, who is the one who fought battles against the enemies of Israel. Her ethnicity is an enemy of Israel. But here she is, it didn't matter. She's trying desperately just to get Jesus' attention. Why? Because her daughter is at home, severely tormented by a demon. So what's Jesus' response? Well, not much of one. In verse 23, Matthew tells us that Jesus didn't even say a word to her. So if you're familiar with the book of Matthew, this is not like Jesus to do this. Everyone who's called out to him in this entire book, he responds to them and he talks to them, but not her. There's something different here. And it's not like Jesus couldn't hear. Even if he couldn't, we've seen Jesus look at people and be able to tell what their thoughts were. The woman with the issue of blood touched the bottom of Jesus' robe in the middle of a crowd, and he felt it. So what Jesus is doing here by not speaking a word to her is he's making a point to her by ignoring her. Meanwhile, the disciples are just tired of it. They're tired of this lady yelling. We see the super sanctified disciples approach Jesus and urge him, "Jesus, can you just send this woman away? She's crying out after us." It's kind of funny. They think she's crying out after the disciples. She's not. She's crying out after Jesus, right? So the disciples, though, they're annoyed by this woman. She won't stop. They ask Jesus, "Can you just do what she's asking? Can you just heal her daughter so she can just kind of be quiet?" So Jesus responds to them. He looks back at the disciples and he's kind of like, "No, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." So this is a weird comment again by Jesus. So she's not an Israelite. I'm not going to help her. She's not one of us. I wasn't sent to her. Remember what Jesus told the disciples when he sent them out in chapter 10. When he sends the disciples out to do ministry, he told his disciples explicitly, he said, "Don't take the road that leads to the Gentiles." That's the road Jesus and his disciples are on. "And don't enter any Samaritan town. Instead, the disciples were to go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Now here we are 5 chapters later, and this shows Jesus wasn't going up to that region to do ministry. He wanted to find rest. And he wanted to, but instead, he gets this Canaanite woman who just encounters him on the road. He didn't go to the Canaanite woman. The Canaanite woman came to him. That's an important note to make. But yet, that wasn't Jesus' mission. She was not his mission. His mission, his disciples' mission, was to go to the Israelites, the lost sheep of the house of Israel, the same lost sheep that were called the Pharisees and the scribes, the ones who couldn't see Jesus for who he was, the ones who needed to see Jesus for who he was. So now Jesus is in the north. He's outside of Gentile territory. He encounters a Canaanite woman, and isn't it odd that this woman, who is as Gentile as it gets, can see Jesus with clear eyes for who he truly is? It's like her eyes are open to him. She knows exactly who he is, yet the first part of chapter 15, it's the people who should see Jesus clearly as the Messiah who are simply blind. In fact, Jesus calls them hypocrites and blind guides. So what's the deal here? Is Jesus just playing hard to get? Didn't Jesus heal the centurion servant a couple chapters ago? The centurion was a Gentile. What's his problem with this woman that he won't even talk to her? Well, it's a good thing the section doesn't end in verse 24, or you get an odd view of Jesus. What I want you to see this morning is the focus is on this woman's desperation. This woman doesn't stop. In verse 22, she doesn't stop crying out. Now she doesn't stop coming to Jesus because she's desperate. His response here in verse 24 was to the disciples. This address, I was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, wasn't meant for the woman, but don't think he didn't say it loud enough for that woman to hear him. So what does the woman do? Instead of walking away, she moves toward Jesus. She came to him, she knelt before him, and she said, "Lord, help me." Look at that word, but. It's like Jesus makes that comment out loud to dissuade her from coming to her, but she didn't seem to care, did she? She's desperate for what she wants. She's desperate for just that little bit of mercy that she seeks, that she knows he can give to her. Look at her posture. She's literally on the ground before him, begging him at his feet. Here's this woman, she's already been told no, but it didn't matter. She keeps coming toward Jesus again because she knows he has the power of healing that nobody else has. He has that mercy that she needs in that moment, and nobody else can give that to her. So here she is at his feet now, crying for help. And Jesus' response again isn't what she wants to hear. For the second time, he kind of looks at her and he now talks to her directly and makes a little bit of a cutting comment. He answered her, "It isn't right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." So you don't really have to be a rocket scientist here to see what Jesus is saying. I know this is really hard for us to see in 2024 United States, where we've elevated our dogs to human status, but it wasn't like that back then, okay? Image bearers were to take care of image bearers. The image bearers are human beings. If the bread was meant for your child, it needed to be given to your child so that your child could grow. Only a fool would take the bread away from their child and feed it to the family dog. And this woman isn't dumb. She knows what Jesus is saying to her. He's sent to the house of Israel, remember? The children of God. That's who Jesus is sent to. Ethnically, this woman's not a child of God. She's super far from a child of God. Ethnically, if this woman's in the house crowded with Jewish people, they're the humans and she's a dog. At this point, especially in our culture, we would have just been offended at Jesus and just walked right on away. First, Jesus ignores her. Now he says something like this. All of us now would have been like, I don't want to deal with this guy. But what does this woman do? She doesn't take no for an answer. She doesn't stop because, again, she knows that the Son of David is standing before her and he has the only thing that she's looking for. So she responds, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." This woman knows who she is. She knows her background. She knows her ethnicity. She knows she's not one of those people who is quote unquote born right. If she's a dog, she's categorizing herself as one. At this point, Jesus has heard and seen everything he needs to hear and see. He turns back to her and says, "Woman, your faith is great. Let it be done for you as you want." And from that moment, her daughter was healed. This woman cries out to Jesus 3 different times. First response, Jesus doesn't say a word to her. Second response, why would I give a dog what's meant for a child? Third response, your faith is great. Your daughter is healed. What was it in that time that made Jesus change so quickly? Let's zoom out and look at this story in full. I think the first thing that Matthew wants us to see is that this woman is filled with desperation. Realize that the story doesn't cut off in verse 24. Jesus answers her 3 times because she comes at him 3 times. The first thing she does is she gets up out of her house. Remember, her daughter's back at home, severely tormented by a demon. She gets up out of her house. Jesus isn't in the city of Tyre. He's not in the city of Sidon. He's most likely in this rural area. The woman gets up off her couch and she gets out of her house. She knows where Jesus is and she seeks where Jesus is, finds him. She moves toward him. She doesn't wait passively for Jesus to come to her. It makes me wonder how desperate we are sometimes because we know God's mercy exists, because we're 2024 Christians. We know all these attributes of God, and we know that all his blessings are supposed to be bestowed upon us. But how desperate sometimes are we to actually get mercy from Christ himself? Just to define the word mercy, because mercy is different from grace. Mercy is the aspect of God's character where he bestows love on those who are miserable. That's different from grace. It's love and help to the miserable. Here, this woman is miserable because of the condition of her daughter. Things aren't going well in this woman's life. Things aren't good at home. There's plenty of us in here that could probably say similar stuff. I know a lot of us aren't going to go home to like our daughter that has a demon in her, but a lot of us know like things might not be great at home. There's hard parts of life. Even if you walked in here and you're just loving life, you love that it's 110 outside and it's sunny every day and you're just walking on sunshine, right? Chances are somebody you know is struggling. If you don't believe me, I can share prayer requests with you that we get every single week. If you sit in this room and you're going through struggles right now, you know that a lot of days, your life looks a lot like I just need to open my eyes in the morning, put my feet on the floor, put a smile on my face, and I simply have to get through it. How many times when you need the mercy of Christ, do you just stand still and expect him to give it to you? This woman is filled with desperation. She cries out to Christ to the point where she was annoying the crowd around Jesus. She doesn't get the answer she wanted the first time. She doesn't even hear back from Jesus, yet she runs up to Jesus and she kneels before him. Jesus calls her a dog, and she's like, well, I guess I'll be a dog and I'll get crumbs from your table then. Church, when we're in need of mercy, are we truly desperate for the mercy of Christ? Or do we just ask once, we don't get the answer we want, so we take things into our own hands, we kind of white-knuckle it through life. We suffer by ourselves, but say we're doing it for Christ, yet Christ is sitting there ready to give you his mercy. You're just not asking for it. This isn't the first time we've seen Jesus heal someone who's desperate. The fact is, when you're desperate for Christ's mercy and when you're desperate for Christ's presence, sometimes those things don't come as fast as you want them to. It takes longer than we want. We don't always get the immediate answer to our prayers that we want. So the question is, if you're walking through life right now and there's some struggles, there's some bumps in the road, is there desperation to continuously seek Christ with those struggles? So that's point number one, but point number two is even more clear. Point number two is that compared to Jesus, this woman knew exactly where she stood. This woman knew her background. She knew her ethnicity. She was all right being called a dog. At the end of the day, she approached Jesus with this posture of humility that I think a lot of us never approach Jesus with. Here she is, a nobody, approaching the Savior of the universe. In all reality, as we sit here this morning, all of us in this room were born dogs. We're born into sin. That from our mother's womb, we are filled with unrighteousness. We know from Scripture that a holy God cannot stand next to sin. We know from Matthew 15 that a Jewish man shouldn't be talking to a Canaanite woman. But here's this woman with complete humility, and we see that through her humble spirit, her faith was considered great. Again, I want you to look at her posture. When she goes up to Jesus in verse 24, what's her posture? She pleads at his feet, begging him for help. Kind of made me think of a lot of like the people who like panhandle today. I do a lot of my meetings in Goodyear, so I get off on I-10 and Estrella/Pebble Creek almost every single day. And there's a different person a lot at that corner. None of those people are going up to vehicles and just like falling on the hot asphalt, just begging for their money. What do those people do at the corner? They just kind of stand there and they passively wait for someone to roll their window down so they could see, and then they go walking slowly up to that car and they grab $1 or $2 or whatever they're offering. Let's just say whoever's standing at that corner right now, one of you left right now, and you went to that corner, and you told the person at the corner, hey, today at 1 p.m., there's going to be a good-looking, baldish dude with a short beard. He's going to drive a white Toyota Tacoma, and he's going to stop at your light about 1 p.m. In his Tacoma, he's going to have a briefcase just filled with cash, $1 million cash. The minute he pulls up, the only way to get that briefcase is that you have to go to his window and just beg like a fool and ask for it, and he will roll his window down and he will give you the briefcase. If you don't ask, if you don't approach him, he's not going to give it to you. I promise you, starting around 12:30, that dude will stand at the corner and his eyes will be wide open, right? Any white truck he sees, could that guy be coming early? Is that a Toyota? Is that a Tacoma, right? He'll look and see, is that guy good looking or not? But right when that truck finally pulls up, I promise you that dude will run right up to the truck and do whatever he possibly can to grab that briefcase. This Canaanite woman did the same exact thing, except it wasn't with money, it was with Jesus' mercy. It's sad, a lot of us would run up to my truck just to get the money, yet we ignore Jesus' mercy. Compared to Jesus, this woman knew exactly where she stood. She approached Christ in humility, knowing that if she was considered a dog, she didn't really care. She doesn't care because she'd rather be a dog next to the master than a child in a house that doesn't have a king in it. She knows that the crumbs from Christ are so much better tasting than a feast that could come from her family tree. If you're in here right now and you don't consider yourself a Christian, I want you to know that right now, as you currently sit, you sit at a dinner table eating food with things that are nothing but crumbs and garbage. In the meantime, this morning, you've seen a very clear picture of Jesus Christ himself, who should not have even talked with this woman, yet he gives her the mercy she asked for because she was humbly desperate for it. This morning, I want to ask you what the posture of your heart is. I want you to know that it's better to eat the crumbs off of Christ's table than eat the feast that the world gives you. But the good news for you this morning is that Christ doesn't feed you crumbs. This morning, when Christ welcomes you into your kingdom, if you're not in his kingdom right now, when he asks you to come into his kingdom, he doesn't ask you to sit like a dog at his table. He welcomes you to feast with him at his table. We see in this story that it had nothing to do with this woman's ethnicity or background. It has nothing to do if you walked in here this morning, just the chief of all sinners, and you thought lightning was going to strike when you walked in here. It has nothing to do with the amount of sins that you've committed, what you've done in your past. None of that matters. It has everything to do with the fact that she just came to him with a humble posture, asking him for mercy, and he gave her mercy. Would you this morning just simply approach Jesus in humility? Approach Jesus with a posture of knowing, look, I may have done a bunch of bad, but this morning I sit here and I have nothing to give you, Jesus. I'm coming to you with just humble, open, empty hands, and I'm just asking for whatever this mercy is that will also be given to me. Suddenly you'll see that the food that you eat from Christ fills you. It doesn't empty you. If that's you this morning, after we take communion, we're going to have some time as we sing one final song for you to just simply pray. To pray to the Lord doesn't need to be some varsity level prayer. Just simply sit in your seat. If the Holy Spirit is tugging on your heart, a prayer like, Christ, I need that same mercy in my life. Christ, would you fill me with your mercy? Christ, would you fill me with your presence? But church, I want to finish with this. I hope you see that the story of the humility that this woman has should match the humility that we have when we approach Christ. So the takeaway for all of us this morning is to examine our approach to what Christ offers. Christ doesn't just offer us mercy, he offers us grace, he offers us salvation, forgiveness of sins. Do you come to Christ, particularly in prayer, do you come to Christ with a humble heart? Do you understand grace as something that I deserve or something that I got when I was a dog? Do you understand that Christ isn't always going to give you what you need the very first time that you ask? When it comes to Christ's mercy, it's given to those who seek it desperately. We look at the progression of, are you desperate enough to ask for something? Then being even more desperate that you're going to get off your couch and seek what you're asking for, than even being more desperate to knock down the door to get to that thing you're asking for. Jesus could have healed this woman's daughter at the first time she's crying out and disrupting all the crowds, but yet he didn't. He wanted to see through the process of her asking that her faith remained great. A lot of times when Christ waits to answer our prayer, it's a test of our faith, right? So are you dealing with something in your life right now that can use a touch of Christ's mercy? I'm sure all of you can name at least one thing. If so, how are you approaching Christ for that mercy? Is there desperation within you? Is there a humility within you? We're going to take communion together this morning. And how amazing is it that all of us in this room who were born Gentiles were on par with this Canaanite woman. All of us who are born distant from Christ now get to gather this morning at his table together. Communion is obviously a time where we remember the sacrifice that Christ made on the cross. That gluten-free cracker that we eat represents Christ's body that was broken for us. The juice represents the blood that was poured out on the cross. The same man who talked with the Canaanite woman in Matthew 15 was placed on a cross so that 2,000 years later, we can sit here this morning and be included in that same exact kingdom he invited her into. It's a crazy thing to think that one day we'll all die, and if you go to heaven, we're going to see this Canaanite woman in heaven, all because of what Christ did on the cross.